Now that I have my lips outlined, the next step is going to be mixing my colors. So for the lips, we're using a monochromatic color scheme, which is one color with multiple tints and shades. In our reference picture, we have areas of black, white, and gray, so we need to mix those three tones. The first is the hue, which we don't actually need to mix. That's the color directly out of the bottle. So I'm going to be using green for my hue. The next color that we need to mix is a tint of green. So I'm going to take green and white and mix those together. And then we're going to need a shade, which is the darker value. So I'm going to take green and black and mix those together. So for my tint, I want to make sure that it is nice and light. So I'm going to use a good amount of white to mix with my green. So I'm going to mix those up. And right now this still even looks a little bit too dark. I want to make it very close to white. So I'm going to grab a good amount more of white here and mix that together until I get a nice light green for my tint. So I'm going to even throw in some more white. Again, you want to make sure that your tint is very close to white so that you have good contrast between the light area and your hue. You want to make sure that there's an obvious big difference between those tones. So now that I have that, I'm going to rinse off my brush in water to clear out that white, dry it off on a paper towel. And then I'm going to grab my green with black. Now we just added a lot of white. However, black is a dark value, so it's going to be a very obvious tone when we mix it. So we do not need very much black at all. It's going to just naturally create a dark green very easily with a tiny bit of color. So now again, I have my shade, my hue, and my tint ready to go. Here is my outline, and I'm going to be looking at my reference picture while I'm drawing this to make sure that I am filling in the correct areas. So I'm going to start out with my shade and fill those in. So the lips are basically going to be the darkest areas that I'm going to fill in first. So I'm going to start with my shade on my lips, and this top part of the lip is the darkest, and get that filled in nice. And as you're working with the acrylic paint, you'll notice that it is a lot smoother and more opaque, so it's not as see-through. I'm not seeing that white of the paper come through, which is nice, so you're not really going to need any more coats than just this first coat, which is creating a nice and thick application of the paint. So that's one of the benefits of the acrylic paint, is that it is going to add a nice dark tone onto your paper. Then I'm going to move on. There's a darker value underneath the lip here. Now when we move on to the next step, which is bringing detail back, we are going to be using acrylic paint to bring our detail back. So the acrylic paint is going to help to really smooth out a lot of these areas and blend our tones together. So it's okay that it's going to look a little bit choppy as you're putting it together. When we go to do the next layer, that's going to really smooth it out and tie things together. So next I'm going to use just the hue in these larger gray areas and get these filled in. As you're working, think about if you like, first of all, working with posturized reference pictures. For your final project, you could decide to use just the original picture that's not posturized and try to find where these different tones are to fill in yourself versus having it already broken up for you. So that's one thing to consider. So think about for your final project, if you're liking this acrylic paint, if you want to work with watercolor, if there's something else that you might want to try for the next practice that you could potentially want to use for your final project. So keep thinking about what's working for you, what's not working, what you like, what you don't like, as we're moving through each step of practice. That way you can put together your final project how you want it to look. So I'm just really taking my time going through this. And then something else to think about for your final project as we're filling this in is how many levels of posturization do you want? So again, right now we're working with just the black, white, and gray areas. But for your final project, you could pasteurize it so that so you have more areas to fill in. So the more areas that you have to fill in, obviously, the trickier it's going to be to keep track of which areas need to be your tones, which ones are your tints, which ones are light and dark. When you get into those 3 or 4 different tones of gray, that's when it becomes a little bit more challenging, but it does create a more detailed overall portrait. So think about if that's something that you do want to try out when you get there. But again, we're going through just getting all of this filled in. So go ahead and finish filling in your hue. So the areas that are gray, which is what I'm finishing up now. Fill in the areas that are black with your darker value, and then fill in all the areas that are white with your highlight. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that up and then move on to the next step of the video, which is adding detail, bringing detail back with acrylic paint.